Good morning, everyone. I'm your host for today, and I would like to start the ARRP webinar on ethical decision-making relating to teaching and wildlife with the acknowledgement of country. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we meet today. I'm, for example, on Dharawal land, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. And I would also like to recognize and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing culture and connections to land, sea, and community. Just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Tim Karl, and I'm a professor for behavioral neuroscience at Western Sydney University. I run preclinical research into brain disorders, and I also chair our university's Animal Care and Ethics Committee. Let me just provide you quickly with some details on the housekeeping for today and how the webinar will proceed. So we have over 60 attendants so far. Over 100 people have registered actually for the webinar. You can submit your questions at any stage during the talks through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The questions will be answered at the end of the session, so once all three speakers have presented. And we will answer as many questions as we can during the webinar time. But rest assured, for the questions we don't answer today, we will circulate a Q&A document following the webinar, as the presenters kindly agreed to actually answer all incoming questions, so everyone will get a response. Finally, please be aware this webinar is recorded, and we will also make the recording available as well at the end in a couple of weeks' time. So let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Peter Fleming from New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. Professor Fleming is a senior principal research scientist with the DPI and also an adjunct professor at the University of New England. He has researched invasive animal issues since the early 1980s and has done this in a variety of different species, including in rabbits, feral goats and pigs, cats, and also red foxes. Peter has been an expert advisor to governments, for example, on the management of predators and flying foxes, the evaluation of feral horse control, and was also involved in policy reforms associated with the review of the New South Wales Proctor Act. He has published about animal welfare and invasive animal and conservation topics, and he's the 100th Fellow of the Royal Zoological Society of New South Wales. Peter will provide some perspectives about the ethics of wildlife management and research and practice. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Tim. The first thing I'd like to do is to acknowledge country, as Tim has already done generally. I'm based in Orange, which is on Wiradjuri country, but I've worked across the country in various lands of First Nations people, and I acknowledge the elders of all those lands and have benefited greatly from their inputs into my research programs. I just want to start off with, I like animals. It's something that's driven me since I was a kid. I like all sorts of animals, both wildlife and domestic animals. But that's largely irrelevant. What I like and dislike should not guide what I do. What is more important are ethics and the morality of doing the work that I do. So my talk today will start with the philosophical principles, just to give some guidelines and define a few terms. I'll also deal with animal ethics principles as applied to animal care and ethics approvals. And then there's some wildlife research principles, some of the things that we do to minimise welfare impacts on the animals that we research. And then some conservation principles, some basic population stuff that guides what we do. And I'll leave a couple of case studies and some concluding remarks. And I'm not going to tell you stuff. I want to raise questions mainly, and I want people to think about these issues. Now, please excuse my voice. I've had a dreaded lurgy, and so I might drop out every now and then and have to have a bit of a cough on the side. That's a feral cat, a stray cat in Singapore, attacking a fairly large insect in downtown Singapore. excuse me, the area that I work is in invasive animals management and the research of those things. And it's practically complex. While it might be simple in theory, it is actually complex because it's a mix of wildlife things and human things. And the human dimension is by far the most complex. And the human area is largely philosophical and ethical questions. And these are social science and philosophy are these study areas where you need to look at those things. And feral cats and domestic cats is obviously an area of controversy. So just a few ethical considerations from the philosophical principles. So I'm defining morals as the rights and wrongs of actions. And ethics are more about the individual and how they accept their moral principles that they run their life under. And obviously there are shared ethics across different communities and different cultures. Values are the things that we give either intrinsic worth or other worths, so that we consider them worthwhile or desirable, or they've got monetary value or value to environments or to cultures. Attitudes are how people evaluate the different objects, people, events, and ideas. And that's, while the first three are fairly set in stone, attitudes can be changed. Beliefs are things that people accept as true, an individual accepts as true, and this is particularly so of religious convictions. Perceptions, however, are slightly different in that they are the things that an individual thinks are true as real, whereas the beliefs are things that people know inherently, or they feel they know inherently. The worldview is how people perceive their relationships with the world, and that includes things like their perceptions and their beliefs and the morals and ethics and so on. Social norms are the expectations about the actions and the behaviours that people will, or a particular people, a group of people, will undertake in relation to what they think is normal, or what is believed to be normal or assumed to be normal, as the social group that they're in acts on at the moment. So the social norms, they are more dynamic. We don't think of them as being dynamic, but they actually are. They evolve in response to information and also noise. And I think about noise as things like social media and so on. That can obviously provide noise, which is different to the information that people are getting. And so norms will shift. So what is acceptable today may not be considered ethical tomorrow. And so I call that normative time. And I think that individuals use that as a subconscious benchmark against which they look at behaviours, and particularly in relation to animal welfare. So I ask a question at the end there, is what I consider ethical shaped by the norms of today or other philosophical standpoints, or are they norms that in my youth, when I was younger, probably the greyest haired person in the audience here. Let's look at the animal ethics. The animal ethics, according to the World Organization of Animal Health in 2007, these are largely derived for farm animals, but there is an application to wildlife as well. And so it refers to the status of the animal at the time, that's their welfare. But the treatment that an animal receives, they will obviously influence the animal's welfare. And things such as the care, the husbandry, and humane treatment. Now, the two things that really relate to wildlife is the animal care and the humane treatment during research processes, for instance, and during treatment of invasive animal populations. So husbandry is not quite something that we really deal with in wildlife research. So leading on from that, and given that it's designed for, these principles are designed for farm animals, it requires, good welfare requires that we prevent disease and provide veterinary treatment where necessary, provide them with animal shelter management, appropriate nutrition, and humane treatment wherever we deal with them, and particularly in relation to slaughter or killing of them. And all those things, except for the veterinary treatment, apply while we're handling animals and also while we're letting them do their own thing out in the wild. Now, obviously, because they're not under human husbandry, some of those things can't be guaranteed. So nutrition, water, and so on may not be provided at any one time because of the seasonal conditions. And wildlife is subject to those more than domestic animals, potentially. So what are the animal welfare principles that we use to set up our wildlife research? And we use the 5 freedoms. So obviously when you're handling animals in a trap or something like that, when you're going to collar them to release them and find out what they do in their lives, you maintain their homeostasis as much as you can. You minimise their hunger and thirst in the traps. You avoid as much discomfort as possible. As much pain, injury, and disease is avoided as well. So, for instance, in the case of disease, you wash your traps between capture of animals. If you put them in a handling bag to ease their stress, you also try and reduce any disease by washing bags between use and so on. Obviously, while they're in capture and you're handling them, they can't express their normal behaviour. But what you want to do is any intervention that you do to study them, you want to make sure that they are free to express their normal behaviour both before and after any intervention that you might have. And obviously fear and distress are going to be there in any handling process or in any humane killing process that you might apply. But you need to minimise those according to whatever the best principles are at the time, the best knowledge is at the time. So we want to do that using the 3 R's, where you have replacement, reduction, and refinement. But obviously, when you're dealing with wild animals, you can't substitute in sentient material because you're trying to find out what these animals do in the wild and how they react to any intervention that you might apply. So it's not usually applicable. So therefore, that leaves you with reduction. So you minimise the number of animals that you need to use in any experimentation. So number of field animals, you minimise the number, but you make sure that you've got enough animals to be statistically valid in any analysis you might want to do. So we minimise the number of animals, but we make sure we've got enough. Otherwise, it's inhumane because if you don't have enough animals, you're exposing animals to some intervention with no gain because you can't analyse it at the end. And obviously, the final thing is the thing that we do most of. You measure any intervention that you cause, and then you improve and refine your treatments as you go. So let's look at population principles for conservation. The underlying premise that we deal with is a thing called the rate of increase of a population. And that's just given the number R. And quite simply, if R is equal to 0, you've got a stable population. If R is greater than 0, your population is growing. And if R is less than 0, the population is declining. Now, that's pretty simple to understand. A little bit more complex than this paper here. So if you're looking at population change, NT plus 1 is basically the population tomorrow. NT is the population today. And if the population tomorrow equals what you've got today, you add the births and any immigration, and you take away any deaths and any immigrants that might leave the area. Importantly, for change of population, if the births and the immigration are greater than the ones that die or leave the population, then the population will persist, i.e. your rate of increase is greater than or equal to 0. And that's what we're trying to do for most of the threatened species and so on that we might be studying if we want to conserve them. If you've got a threatening process, and the example I'm giving here is dingo predation of bridle nail-tail wallabies, if the threatening process is pushing them towards extinction, that means that they're making the rate of increase less than 0 of that population. So you need to, that'll keep doing that until you remove that threat or exclude the threat. So if invasive impacts are related to the density of animals, you've got to make sure that any population control that you might apply is sufficient to make the population size tomorrow less than what it is today, so that you achieve negative R, negative rate of increase. And that's what is, yes, that's what is encompassed in a proportional reduction of the population. If you don't achieve enough, you're wasting animals. You're affecting animals that you don't need to affect. So you must try and achieve that proportional rate to negate the rate of increase, or make sure that the rate of increase goes below zero. So I'll give the case of feral horse management here, and I'm not using feral in a derogatory term. I'm using it as a derogatory term or otherwise. It's just a scientific term that means it's a domestic animal that's gone wild. And they've got multiple values. And that causes all sorts of complex relationships in human discourse. But from the point of view of wildlife conservation, we need to measure their negative impacts. We need to work out also how much control is enough to achieve that negative negative rate of increase, and what proportion is needed. And then also what research interventions are needed. You need to ask those sort of questions of yourself before you embark on deciding how many you need to remove or exclude. So here are some of the considerations that the animal care and ethics need to do. They need to think about the differences between wild and domestic horses. We've got to look at the attitudes, values, etc., of the people that are making these decisions and are going to be affected by these decisions, or just are interested in feral horse management. And you've got to take into consideration the opposing interest groups. So, for instance, you have Brumby advocates versus conservationists. You have conservationists versus animal rights people. And you've got to remember too that the whole reason for the research is for the conservation of all those different values that people have. So while you're doing the research, you need to measure physiological responses to the research and also to the management intervention. So that's cortisol levels, fear responses, behavioural responses, all those sort of things. They need to be evaluated. And when you look at the current scientific evidence, aerial shooting comes up as being more humane than capture and holding and so on, because it's quicker and the death endpoint happens very quickly. I'll race through this one. The case study of threatened species in this case is spotted-tailed quolls, and it's likely that you must control dogs and foxes in order for them to persist. So we've looked at around the country, we've exposed quolls accidentally to aerial baiting programs with wild dog strength baits, and there's the possibility of both positive or negative impacts on the quoll populations, and there's divided opinions about dingoes and other wild dogs as well to consider. But when we looked at the evidence, we found that there's a 96 times more greater likelihood of finding quolls where you have been doing wild dog control and fox control for a long period of time. So the conclusion there is that dog baiting is actually beneficial for quolls, which comes up with, then you've got to decide, is that an ethical treatment or not? It's a valuation that you must make. I'll skip over that one because I don't have time. Concluding remarks. All things die. So death is part of life, and all things, all vertebrate and sentient animals live by killing or injuring other organisms, whether they be plants or other animals, and humans are not exempt from those biological imperatives. We've got to consider the welfare of the researchers that might be handling these animals. Their well-being is also important, and that is sometimes ignored. And a thing that I'd just like to indicate is sometimes it's more ethical from my point of view to kill things than not to. But if you must study or manage these things, please do it as humanely as possible and measure what you're doing so that you can improve the welfare outcomes for the animals that you're dealing with. If you do need to kill things, is it ethical to try and achieve something that is less than the proportional reduction that's necessary? That's the question that needs to be asked. And the other thing is to just remember that every decision that you make or every intervention that you want to put in is a result of a value judgment that you have to make. My final thing is that my conservation ethics are determined basically by my upbringing, and that's a picture of my father there. He's 93, and his basic thing is he's a farmer, and his basic driver is his ethic is that he's got to leave the place as good as he found it or better. And my mother's ethic was that if you made a mess, you've got to clean it up. And I think that we, particularly European Australians, are responsible for managing the impacts of invasive animals that we have introduced. So there's some of my drivers, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was a very interesting talk, and I think you covered some of the basics around ethical decision-making as well, which is a great introduction to our webinar. And I also like that you included some of the real-world examples around, for example, the feral horse management, which of course has recently made it back to the front pages of newspapers. So our next speaker is Dr. Anne Quain from the University of Sydney. Anne is a senior lecturer in the Sydney School of Veterinary Science, and she also works in a private practice as a veterinarian. So she's still on the ground doing her job. She's a member of the Australian and New Zealand College of Veterinary Scientists Animal Welfare Chapter, and she's also a diplomat of the European College of Animal Welfare and Behavioural Medicine in Animal Welfare Science, Ethics and Law. Anne's PhD thesis was about ethical challenging situations encountered by veterinarians. And Anne is also the author and editor of several books, including, for example, The Veterinary Ethics, Navigating Tough Cases. Anne and I know each other from previously working together on the Western Sydney University ACIP. Looking forward to your talk, Anne.
Thank you so much, Tim. Hopefully everyone can see the screen. Thank you for joining us today on the webinar, and I'm going to talk a little bit about ethical decision-making relating to teaching and wildlife studies. Okay, I actually think that it is really important to understand the perspective from where the speakers come from. My perspective is not impartial, and I don't think it has to be. So my perspective is as a clinical veterinarian. I work in general practice where I do treat occasional wildlife, usually those that have come into contact with humans or our companion animals. I'm also a veterinarian and academic working in the field of animal welfare science, ethics and law. I do conduct research. Mostly my research is on human subjects, and mostly it's in the form of surveys and interviews. I also teach veterinary students in the Sydney School of Veterinary Science and veterinary students and technicians at the University of Queensland, many of whom undertake research on humans or animals or both. And as Tim mentioned, I'm a former Animal Ethics Committee member, and I saw my role on an Animal Ethics Committee as someone who was there to facilitate ethical research. This is a really, really brief talk, so my aim is definitely not to solve all of the ethical problems you face. Sorry if that disappoints anyone, but rather I just want to raise some considerations that impact ethical decision-making around teaching and wildlife studies. And as a researcher myself, I've learned to treat my ethics applications as drafts of my introduction and my materials and methods section of my paper, rather than as a barrier to doing research. So in other words, the ethics application I see as part of my research, and I find that my students find this a whole lot less objectionable if they see their ethics application in this way as well. So hopefully that's a bit of a tip for people. Well, I think most people at this webinar are very familiar with the regulation of animal research in New South Wales. It doesn't hurt to be reminded that individuals and organisations, of course, have to comply with the Animal Research Act, the Animal Research Regulation, and the Australian Code for the Care and Use of Animals for Scientific Purposes, which is in its 8th edition. It's the 2013 edition. And in New South Wales, what is an animal? It's a vertebrate, including mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish, but not people. So that encompasses, of course, laboratory animals, farm animals, and wildlife, whether free-ranging or captive bred or purpose-bred, but obviously that's not so much the case with wildlife. Research is defined explicitly in our legislation. On this slide, I've tried to highlight aspects of research that I think are most applicable to wildlife. So that includes things like surgical, medical, psychological, biological, chemical, or physical treatment, subjecting animals to abnormal conditions of heat, cold, light, dark, confinement, noise, isolation, or overcrowding, and sometimes an abnormal or altered dietary condition as well, and of course removal of tissue, blood, and so on. And additionally, research also does include the use of animals in teaching and field surveys as well. What doesn't count as research is the administration of veterinary treatment for the purpose of protecting an individual animal and normal husbandry, although again, as Peter pointed out, that's more husbandry is more related to farm animals and laboratory animals rather than wildlife as such. So the code is underpinned by this notion of respect, which the code itself explains brings with it the responsibility that the scientific use of animals is ethically acceptable. And what does it mean by ethically acceptable? Well, it implies that that means balancing the welfare costs of use to the animals against those benefits to humans, animals, or the environment. So from an ethical perspective, and I guess my background is in philosophy, this is a little bit confusing because it actually conflates a couple of different ethical approaches. Respect, we can define that as giving due regard to the feelings, wishes, and rights, or for some people that might be the interests of others, and that can include animals. And that's a very Kantian or deontological approach to ethics. Respect for others in this view requires that we don't simply use them as a means to our own ends, and that in general, we treat others in the way we want to be treated. It also requires that we use the precautionary principle. So thus in section 110 of the code, it is argued that unless there's evidence to the contrary, it must be assumed that procedures and conditions that would cause pain and distress in humans cause pain and distress in animals. So that's respect, but the weighing of costs and benefits is more aligned with the utilitarian approach, which is an approach that seeks to minimize harms or pain or other things that we count as costs, while maximizing things like well-being or pleasure or other things that we count as benefits. And just as an aside, a lot of people mistake Peter Singer, the author of Animal Liberation, as an animal rights philosopher. He's actually a utilitarian. I'm not going to get into that now because that's a whole other can of worms. But you'd all be familiar with the 3 R's, which seek to minimize the welfare costs of animals involved in research, and they are a utilitarian approach. Now, a criticism of utilitarianism is that the costs and benefits are often unevenly distributed. So some individuals, like the animals that we use, might bear all of the costs in terms of absorbing all of the harms of research, while others, like people, enjoy all of the benefits with very few costs involved. And the 3 R's themselves are open to different interpretations. So those of you who are on animal ethics committees or those of you who've interacted with them might get a sense that different people have different ideas about what the 3 R's actually oblige us to do. So one reading of the 3 R's in my experience, a very common reading, it's a very pragmatic reading, is that you should replace and reduce and refine the use of animals where possible, i.e. the 3 R's should be implemented, but obviously being mindful of economic and resource constraints and timeframes, recognizing that researchers often have to meet particular milestones and conduct their research within limited timeframes. And of course, where ethics committees insist that this is mandatory for our research to go ahead. Now, some people read the 3 R's as much stronger than that. And so to these people, replacement, that is the first R, must be considered seriously and absolutely comprehensively before we even worry or think about those other things. And only after that should we consider reduction and refinement. And those should be implemented, of course, to their maximum. Now, as Peter raised, this is really challenging with regards to wildlife. It can be really difficult to replace animals where studies involve any sort of research on species that are poorly characterized, or where the research is focused on aspects of behavior, because you need a whole animal in order to behave, or whether you're studying interactions between conspecifics or other animals or the environment. Now, of course, researchers often claim that the bar set by animal ethics committees is too high, but animal advocates and some members of animal ethics committees might argue that, in fact, it's quite low. I want to talk a little bit about conflicts of interest, because I think this is a really fascinating area when we talk about the ethics of animal use. And I realize this is a little bit provocative, but I think it's worth talking about. Are there conflicts of interest between the interests of researchers and the interests of wildlife subjects? Now, there are only two stakeholders in research, and when it comes to research, there's heaps of potential stakeholders that we could examine. But if we just consider these for the purpose of a very short talk, how might these interests come into conflict? What are the interests of researchers? Well, they have an interest in answering their research questions using a robust study design that's defendable, usually within a limited time frame, and usually with the view to publish and disseminate those findings. As an academic myself, I'm expected by my institution to publish the findings of my research. They wouldn't be so supportive if I wasn't doing that. And in the process of doing that research, researchers might develop specialized skills that become the foundation for future work. They might also have a personal interest in being in contact with animals or their habitats. It was mentioned before, the importance or the relevancy of whether we like animals. I actually find that most people who want to research animals like them. And when you ask people about why they became an animal researcher, it's often because they wanted to be in the proximity of animals. So these researchers also have an interest in employment security and career advancement. And of course, they've got an interest in being able to make decisions about how they spend their time. So the interests of wildlife research subjects are a little harder to fathom because I'm not one, but I would imagine they are to minimise unnecessary negative welfare states or negative affective states, to maximise positive welfare states. They have an interest in individual survival and also their own agency, i.e. how they spend their time. And they might also have interest in the viability of their conspecifics as well. So wildlife are considered quite differently to other research subjects in many ways, and I wanted to touch on some of the ways they might be considered different. Now, as I go through this list of considerations, you might agree or disagree. I'm not suggesting that these are right or wrong, but these are some ways that I've encountered whereby people consider wildlife a little bit ethically different. So there's different reasons that researchers or institutions or community members or animal advocates might weigh the interests of their wildlife research subjects differently than, say, the interests of domestic or laboratory animals. And these factors themselves might cause individuals to have lower or higher thresholds for the justification for using wildlife in research. So, for example, wildlife aren't owned, so that obviates the need, obviously, for informed consent. In the wild, they live a life that is nasty, brutish, and short, and therefore, they're subject to adverse weather events, disease, predation, habitat encroachment, negative interaction with humans like motor vehicle accidents, and so on. And for some people, these shorter lifespans and often almost inevitably bad ends mean that any alternative to that, such as being humanely euthanized, is a lesser evil. They're free roaming and they can be really difficult to capture and recapture. And thus, some may argue that any opportunity to conduct research should prioritise the most comprehensive sample collection possible, but that obviously has implications for the research subject, so that take all the samples approach. They're not habituated to humans, and some argue this causes them more stress when they encounter humans. Some argue it causes them less stress, and it might be species specific. And habituations to humans might be very undesirable because that can put those animals more at risk of predation and trauma. I know certainly with preclinical veterinary students, for example, there's a really popular misconception among those students that mere observation of wildlife is a totally benign intervention, and we know that that's not necessarily the case. And sorry, there's also marked variation between species, which can be really difficult in terms of developing standard operating procedures and guidelines. They're not purpose-bred. Some people actually think that's ethically better because they've lived a free-roaming life, and therefore they feel like it's ethically superior to use wildlife in research. And I guess unlike laboratory animals, which tend to be studied as models of human disease or for basic science, wildlife studies tend to be ethically justified on the grounds of potential benefits to species or biodiversity rather than a direct benefit to humans. But that's, again, a generalization. And finally, in some contexts, wildlife are considered vermin or pests, and that can actually make their use more attractive. There is a common bias against animals that are considered or classified as pests, such that they're often treated as not as sentient or having less capacity to suffer than those who are not. So just a couple more slides. Miriam Zemanova published an excellent review of the implementation of the 3 Rs in wildlife research. She argued that the process of incorporating the 3 Rs had been unfortunately slow and their importance overlooked. And she says that might be due to common assumptions underpinning wildlife research, one being that it has an insignificant impact on the animals studied, despite often involving chasing, capture, transport, confinement, tissue sampling, marking, attachment or implantation of data loggers, and even lethal sampling. Another common assumption is that the impacts on individual animals are outweighed by the benefits to the population. But Zemanova argues that where possible, non-invasive methods should be used, and they may offer a form of replacement of animals as well as reduction and refinement. And I've put the QR code to the paper on the slide just so you can have a look at that paper yourself. But similarly, when it comes to teaching as well, we need to consider whether domesticated species can be used to reduce or eliminate wildlife, or whether non-animal models can be used to teach the principles or skills involved. So in summary, as an ethics committee member, one frustration that I personally experienced with animal-based research in general, that it was evident from some applications that researchers came up with their study design first and then thought about ethics after because they had to. And you can tell applications that are developed like this because they often deal with replacement and reduction in a very perfunctory manner, and they tend to focus a bit more on refinement, but only insofar as the study design and budget allowed it. And I do acknowledge there are systemic, institutional, and social pressures that are exerted on researchers that promote this approach. But I would just say it's good to remind ourselves that respect requires that we consider ethics throughout the process. And indeed, that's what the code requires. And that means that ensuring that the research is scientifically robust, that replacement is genuinely considered and discussed in the ethics application, even if that's if animals aren't replaced, that the number of animals is robustly justified, and that refinement is practiced conscientiously and with input from wildlife experts and veterinarians. In summary, researchers are ethically obligated and in fact compelled by our legislation to propose a really clear research question or justification for using animals in teaching and research. And given that animals are sentient and have affective states and interests that matter to them, we need to explain why we should use animals as a means to answer this question and how we plan to minimize negative impacts and maximize positive outcomes. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Anne. I think that was a great presentation, and using your various roles and experiences in the field provide a multifaceted perspective into this topic is really helpful, I think, including also your potential, mentioning the potential COIs between researchers and the wildlife which is researched. Very interesting. Let's go to our final speaker. And this is Associate Professor Michelle Campbell from the University of Sydney. Michelle is a wildlife veterinarian with expertise in conservation medicine, nutrition, One Health, One Welfare, and the ethics associated with the care and management of wild, zoo, and exotic species. She is the Associate Professor in Wildlife and Avian Medicine at the university, where she is involved in research, teaching, and clinical wildlife practice. Michelle also spent over 2 years with the New South Wales DPI Animal Welfare Unit and has worked as a clinical vet at Taronga Zoo for more than 15 years. She has taken on various roles and is, for example, currently the president of the Australian New Zealand College of Veterinary Sciences Zoo and Wildlife chapter, and she is also board member of Wildlife Health Australia. Over to you, Michelle. You might still be on mute.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that kind introduction. Hopefully you can hear me now and see the slides. In this short presentation, I'd really like to delve into the what, where, how and why veterinarians should be involved in wildlife field research. And thanks very much to Peter and Anne for really thought-provoking talks. I've really enjoyed that. I hope this one will be helpful for those planning projects, members of AECs considering project proposals, and anyone else who has an interest in promoting wildlife welfare and good research practice. So wildlife field research encompasses a wide range of activities, including studies to evaluate observational aspects of wild animal biology, population dynamics, reproduction and behaviour. Wild animals might be used as indicators of environmental health or to better understand ecological relationships and the health and conservation of species. Some studies are more invasive or impactful than others and may involve capture, transportation, manipulation of the environment or social groupings, tagging, blood sampling, transmitter placement, and the use of attractants or surgery. One crucial difference between wild animal studies and the use of laboratory animals is that the subject of interest and focus of investigation is usually the subject animal in its own right, rather than serving as a model. But regardless, animal welfare is a key consideration in the ethical deliberations of what is considered acceptable research practice, as has already been touched on. So standard guidelines, regulations and protocols designed for livestock or captive wildlife research may require modification to accommodate the challenges of research in a field setting. A primary objective of regulation of all animal research is to minimise animal suffering, and any deviation from this norm requires justification. So we've heard the basic goals of ensuring humane treatment, limiting distress or pain. These must take into account consideration of biological, geographical, environmental and seasonal factors. And capture and handling of a wild animal by its very nature introduces measurable changes in behaviour, physiology, stress and fear, and includes the possibility of death. And even under the best of field conditions, capture alone might result in some level of mortality. And further to that, any work with free-ranging wildlife has the ability to negatively impact not just the individual animal, but the population or ecosystem more broadly. Now, historically, with the exception of disease-specific studies or those requiring anaesthesia of high-risk animals or in high-risk situations, much wildlife field research has been conducted without direct veterinary involvement, including at the point of making ethical decisions surrounding study design proposals and the welfare costs that might be incurred by individual study animals. And this has been facilitated by legislation that permits researchers under certain permits to conduct some acts of veterinary science and or have access to some drugs that are otherwise only allowed to be used by registered vets or under their direct supervision. But this apparent absence of veterinary collaboration is changing, and as I hope to convey in the next 10 or so minutes, there are assorted reasons for and benefits of this change for both the animals and for the research. And it's hoped that both investigators and AEC members, so Category A members who are vets, but also the members of other categories, assessing applications and considering whether veterinary input is relevant, appropriate, and or has been applied sufficiently to answer the research question in an acceptable manner. And it's worth pointing out advancements in the arena of wildlife veterinary science to complement their extensive training in general animal handling and management, disease prevention, diagnosis and treatment, pharmacology, preventative health management, detection and control of pain and other adverse welfare situations, anaesthesia and, of course, surgery, as well as clinical decision-making and euthanasia. The number of vets gaining postgraduate qualifications, specifically in wildlife and conservation medicine, is constantly growing. So where once there was a very small group of vets who may be able to provide detailed and knowledgeable input into a research program, there is now a growing cohort to call upon. And unlike when I graduated, there are now residencies offered in multiple states in Australia, as well as masters and PhD programs and membership of the Australian New Zealand College in Health Management of Australasian Wildlife. And of course, wildlife veterinary knowledge and skills are in a state of constant improvement, and it's a field that requires its custodians to remain really at the forefront of the latest developments. We know that animal welfare is a growing concern for stakeholders in wildlife research, and ethics committees, employers, journal publishers, and funding agencies are increasingly requiring researchers to consider and address the welfare implications of their research. As already mentioned, given the societal concern and the impacts of animal welfare on research quality, implementation of the 3 Rs in wildlife research should be as strict as for other research areas. And high standards of scientific integrity are expected of researchers. Investigators must use methods that accord with current best practice. So by way of guidance, and as a bit of a refresher for those who haven't looked at the code for a little while, there are these particular clauses to keep in mind when considering where veterinary input might be appropriate. So clause 2.1.5 states that institutions must promote compliance with the code by ensuring availability and access to veterinary advice to safeguard animal wellbeing, and the appointment of an officer with veterinary or other appropriate qualifications to ensure that activities proceed in compliance with the code and the decisions of the AEC. With respect to animal care and management, Clause 2.18 references the direction of competent people with appropriate animal care or veterinary qualifications or experiences, and ensuring availability and access to appropriate veterinary and diagnostic services. And Clause 2.4.18 discusses avoiding or minimising harm, including pain and distress, by the use of pharmacological agents such as anaesthetics, analgesics, which are pain relievers, and sedatives. And it makes the point that these must be consistent with current veterinary or medical practice, and that anaesthesia must be used for procedures that are likely to cause pain of a kind and degree for which anaesthesia would normally be used in veterinary or medical practice. Clause 2.5.5 states that animal carers must take prompt action based on the monitoring and assessment of animal wellbeing in response to unexpected adverse events and emergencies and seeking veterinary advice. And this is reiterated in Clause 3.2.1 and in Clause 3.3.4. There is mention of prolonged restraint or confinement, which requires that the animals must be assessed regularly by a person with veterinary or other appropriate qualifications who is independent of the project. And finally, in Clause 3.3, in relation to anaesthesia, analgesia, and surgery, there are repeated references to paralleling and conforming to their use in current veterinary or medical practice, which, as I mentioned earlier, is constantly evolving, especially in the disciplines of conservation and wildlife medicine. To protect the health, welfare, and safety of animals, some procedures and activities are legally defined as restricted acts of veterinary science. And these do vary somewhat between jurisdictions, but broadly they include things like performing invasive or surgical procedures on animals, administering anaesthetics to animals, and prescribing veterinary pharmaceuticals. And there are particularly tight restrictions on access to some drugs for use in animals, such as Schedule 8 drugs like opioids and ketamine. And the intent here is that a formal degree in veterinary science is considered the minimum acceptable knowledge base and skill set necessary to perform these acts competently. There are, however, some areas that may be exempt for specific procedures under certain legislation, including research. And the code does require that a program of veterinary care be established wherever animals are to undergo procedures that include acts of veterinary science. And it also requires that non-vet researchers to be assessed and certified as competent to undertake these procedures, even if the exemption applies. And at a minimum, there should be some veterinary oversight. So the question here for researchers and AECs to consider is, even if something is permitted legally via an exemption, is it best practice? Is the veterinary collaboration for a particular proposal appropriate for a given project, in that it can be said to be reducing animal use and refining the methods to decrease negative impacts? If anaesthesia is used, are those that are monitoring it adequately experienced, and are handling and marking methods the least impactful? There's really now widespread recognition that an interdisciplinary and collaborative approach to wildlife research leads to increased knowledge transfer and improved outcomes. Coordination between vets and wildlife research groups with similar goals can reduce the number of animals used. Improved capture methods can result in fewer captures of non-target animals, and refinement includes improved handling techniques and anaesthesia that minimises morbidity and mortality. The latest sampling techniques, so for example, the collection of only very small amounts of blood for tests that used to require significantly more, can reduce impact on individuals and therefore populations. And this is good for both animal welfare and for the quality of the research data. And it can actually reduce costs, with many examples demonstrating this, especially in high profile or endangered species. With wildlife fieldwork, many factors are outside your control, and this can be true for animal welfare, both before and after a research interaction. We know that wildlife field conditions are more heterogeneous than laboratory studies, and there are biological variations within species, non-standardised environmental conditions, and many unknowns to contend with. Free-ranging wild animals are not accustomed to humans and the research process, and so capture, handling, marking, sampling are likely to be perceived as major stresses by the animal, and care may be compromised due to difficult and sometimes unanticipated conditions. But this truism should not result in a cutting of corners or excusing of poor standards, but rather ethical integrity necessitates additional preparedness and contingency planning. For example, in a project in which animals are trapped, an animal in poor health may be inadvertently captured, and this can pose an ethical and emotional challenge for wildlife researchers. When animals are anaesthetised, there can be rapid alterations in their physiological status, and having personnel on site with the experience to respond to that change is important. Even after recovery, unlike in a domestic animal setting, post-procedure monitoring of an animal is minimal and may mean that thresholds for acceptable practice differ between lab and field contexts. And it's vital that a field team includes those with the knowledge and skills to respond quickly and to intervene appropriately if problems are noted. And furthermore, in circumstances where there's an unanticipated adverse event requiring immediate veterinary attention and/or euthanasia, it's vital that best practice decision-making and methods are used. Last year, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine in the US hosted a really great symposium on animal welfare challenges in research and education on wildlife. And relevant to this conversation was a session on the role of veterinarians in wildlife research. And their unique approach that they took was to look at the vet's role from both the biologist's and the veterinarian's perspective in order to really openly address any conflicts that exist and to enhance collegiality and collaboration. Seeking veterinary approval for certain activities was identified as a challenge for biologists, especially when different veterinary entities provided conflicting advice. And the real or perceived outranking of a vet's expertise based on their qualification can be seen as counterproductive if it doesn't account for the experience, the insights, and the knowledge of biologists. And there was a sense that the legal and ethical responsibilities of vets are more clearly defined than that of biologists. The complicated environment in which research takes place adds to the complex dynamic, which has regrettably in some situations become a biologist versus vet situation. From the vet's perspective, a functional vet-client-patient relationship like that exists with domestic animals and their owners is really different in a wildlife field setting, but the legal obligations are actually the same. And there are rules that vets have to follow and respect, but interpretation by others can differ. And many vets report witnessing procedures being conducted by non-vets in field settings that would be considered unacceptable elsewhere. So really, the key factors in fostering a positive vet-biologist relationship were highlighted as flexibility and mutual respect. And it was recognised that better training for both parties and seeking additional subject matter expertise can really benefit animal welfare. There are now many examples of successful field collaboration between vets and researchers, including such diverse projects as shark tagging and the health assessment of marine mammals, post-release monitoring of endangered birds. But one example I'd just like to finish with and share from my own experience is that of the Mile Lakes Dingo Dappen project. The overall aim of this project is to develop and test non-lethal tools for dingo management and to further understand population dynamics and individual pack movements through the landscape. One aspect of this project involves the placement of GPS collars on selected dingoes from different packs. And the really great experience, certainly for me, has been that veterinary ecologist collaboration has occurred throughout this project, from the planning phase through field procedures to the analysis of findings. And it's resulted in the testing and refinement of trapping methodology using best practice techniques adapted from captive settings. We've been able to do comprehensive health assessments of the subject animals and used anaesthetic options that have really been optimised with access to a full suite of agents used in contemporary veterinary practice. And additionally, there's been opportunities for bilateral professional development. Unexpected challenges have been addressed quickly and additional research outputs possible without additional animal use. And so just to finish, I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Neil Jordan and the entire dingo field team, as well as the Warrami people on whose country the dingo work is conducted. Also, many thanks to colleagues Claire Madden, Paul Eden and Brett Gardner for contributing to discussions in the preparation of this webinar. And I've included some references here, including those from that workshop I mentioned, for those keen to explore the topic a little further, and really welcome any comments or questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Michelle. For obviously sharing your experience, but also to provide some guidance for ACAC members. Looking at the Q&A, I think that's really needed. And as mentioned before, we will answer all the questions which have come up. Looking at the time, I think we have a couple of minutes to perhaps ask at least one or two questions. I would have one for all three speakers. Peter mentioned noise, so that ethical opinions are obviously being affected by the society, and that also includes social media. So wildlife research, for example, generates a lot of interest in the community. So is this noise helpful, or rather a hindrance in the process of deciding what is ethical and acceptable? So as an example, perhaps again, Peter mentioned the horse management, and if you have seen what's out there in the community, there are quite contrary views from different sections of our community, and obviously they voice it quite intensely. So what is your feel? Is social media and people posting things, is this helpful to understand what society is after, or is this a hindrance because it's a little bit whoever cries the loudest is heard first? Anyone?
I wasn't sure if that was a question for Peter. Did you want?
For all three of you. From your perspective, do you think that social media inputs on ethical consideration is helpful?
Well, I think that the problem with it is that it's very biased. We know that a lot of it's algorithm driven. So you can't use social media as a reliable indicator of the proportion of people who hold a particular view. However, it can be a rich data source, and it may give some insights into different perspectives, and therefore it's helpful to that extent. But I wouldn't use it to judge the social license or popularity of something.
Peter or Michelle, you want to add anything?
I was just going to add that I guess one of the pitfalls with using social media to gauge these kind of things is that often the content is based on incomplete information about what is being given an opinion on. And so the context needs to be clear. And this is where I think, AECs are in a really trusted position. They get access to the full proposal of a wildlife research plan and have the opportunity to ask intelligent questions about about things and have a discourse with a researcher about what's proposed and how those ethical considerations have been considered in the planning. So I think social media gives us an insight into some of the key issues that are concerning the community, but I think we do need to be very careful at relying too much on that content.
Great, thank you. Peter, do you have a final comment to this?
Yeah,
I'm looking
I
at the
agree.
time that probably...
The summaries of the other two speakers have given. What we've got to remember is that the social media reflects extremes, usually expects extremes, and so we should just take that as rather than indicative of what the society generally thinks or what are norms, but more as what are the extremes on the distribution of opinions. And they're usually the pros and the against are usually people that are not going to be shifted in their opinions and what they want done. It's the people in the middle, the great unwashed, if you like, are the most people that are apathetic or haven't really thought through the issues, that are the ones that we need to think about, because animal care and ethics opinions, opinions that are and judgments need to be judged on the overall community, not just any particular extremes. So it's useful, but we should be very careful on how we interpret that information from social media.
Great, thank you. Looking at the time, unfortunately, I think we have to conclude the webinar. So I would like to thank all our three speakers again for a very interesting session, and also our audience for their attendance. I think we had over 100 attendees. The DPI and ARRP will follow up, as mentioned before, with a recording of the webinar and a document containing all the answers to your questions. This will happen within the next 1 or 2 weeks. And just finally, please be aware that ARRP plans to host another webinar series in 2024. Further information will be circulated via email closer to the date. Thank you and have a good day.